May 26, 1978, Atlantic City, New Jersey. The boardwalk at dawn. Resorts International Casino opened its doors at 10 a.m., and by 10:03 the slot machines were singing. Thousands of people had lined up before sunrise, some sleeping on the boardwalk planks, others drinking coffee from thermoses, all waiting for the same thing: the first legal casino gambling on the East Coast since 1910. Inside, the casino floor gleamed: fresh carpet, polished chandeliers, blackjack tables arranged in perfect rows. The smell of new construction still hung in the air: paint, varnish, ambition. Within days, organized crime figures from Philadelphia to New York would begin calculating how to extract profit from this new empire. Not by standing on the casino floor, not by walking through the front doors like tourists, but by infiltrating the infrastructure that made the casinos function: the unions, the contractors, the vendors, the political machinery. Atlantic City was supposed to save itself with gambling. Instead, it became a battlefield. The mob expected another Vegas, a place where frontmen could hide ownership, where cash could disappear before anyone counted it, where regulation meant looking the other way for the right price. They were wrong. What they found instead was a fortress, a regulatory machine designed specifically to keep them out, a system built on background checks, exclusion lists, and career bureaucrats who couldn't be bribed, threatened, or frightened. For the next decade, organized crime would throw everything at Atlantic City: union corruption, labor racketeering, loan sharking, subcontract scams, violence, intimidation, millions of dollars in legal fees fighting licensing denials. None of it worked. This is the story of the mob's greatest miscalculation. The story of how the biggest crime families in America tried to infiltrate a legal gambling empire and lost to a file cabinet full of background checks. 1964, Atlantic City, the boardwalk at dusk. The hotels were dying, not slowly, not gracefully. The grand resort palaces that once defined Atlantic City, the Traymore, the Marlborough Blenheim, the Ambassador, stood half empty. Windows dark, ballrooms silent, salt water corroding the iron supports beneath the boardwalk. Atlantic City had been America's playground. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was where presidents vacationed, where Miss America was crowned, where families from Philadelphia and New York spent summers in oceanfront luxury. The steel pier stretched 1,600 feet into the Atlantic. Big bands played every night. The rolling chairs carried tourists down the boardwalk in wicker seats pushed by uniformed attendants. Then the world changed. After World War II, Americans started flying to Miami, to Las Vegas, to the Caribbean. Places with year-round sunshine and newer hotels and cheaper airfare. Atlantic City's tourism economy collapsed. The grand hotels closed one by one. By the 1960s, the city had the highest unemployment rate in New Jersey. Crime rates soared. The boardwalk at night became dangerous. Entire blocks sat abandoned. The city was drowning in poverty and civic corruption. Atlantic City wasn't just broke. It was broken. The population had declined from a peak of 66,000 in 1930 to approximately 40,000 by the mid-1970s. Property values had collapsed. The tax base couldn't support basic city services. Unemployment exceeded 15%, more than double the national average. State officials recognized that without radical intervention, Atlantic City would become a permanent economic disaster zone. 1974 to 1976, Trenton, New Jersey, the state legislature. The state needed a solution. Casino gambling had been illegal in New Jersey since 1897, but desperation breeds radical ideas. If Las Vegas could build an economy on dice and cards, why not Atlantic City? The proposal: legalize casino gambling, but only in Atlantic City. Restrict it to hotel casinos to encourage tourism infrastructure. Tax the revenue to fund programs for seniors and the disabled. Market it as economic salvation. The first referendum in 1974 failed. Voters rejected it statewide, worried about organized crime, moral decline, and the social costs of gambling addiction. The vote was 60% against, 40% in favor, a decisive rejection. But Atlantic City kept dying. 2 years later, legislators tried again. This time, they added stricter promises, ironclad regulation, no mob infiltration, state oversight of every aspect of casino operations. The campaign emphasized that New Jersey would not repeat Nevada's mistakes. Casino revenue would be taxed at 8%, significantly higher than Nevada's rate. The money would fund programs for the elderly and disabled, giving the referendum a social welfare component. On November 2, 1976, New Jersey voters approved the referendum, 56.6% in favor, 43.4% against. Atlantic City would get its casinos. But the state wasn't naive. Officials had watched Las Vegas spend decades trying to purge mob influence. Frontmen owning casinos, skimming operations, siphoning millions, violent settling disputes. Nevada's regulatory agencies had been weak, underfunded, and often corrupted by the very people they were supposed to regulate. New Jersey decided to do it differently. The Casino Control Act, passed in 1977, created the most aggressive gambling oversight system in American history. 2 agencies would control every aspect of the industry: the Casino Control Commission, CCC, 5 commissioners appointed by the governor. Their job: grant or deny casino licenses, set policy, enforce compliance. The Division of Gaming Enforcement, DGE, a full-time investigative agency staffed with former prosecutors, accountants, and law enforcement officers. Their job: investigate every person, every company, every transaction connected to Atlantic City casinos. The core principle was suitability. Every casino employee, from the CEO to the janitor mopping floors, needed a license proving they had no criminal ties, no mob associations, no history that suggested corruption. The licensing process was unprecedented in its scope. Casino corporations had to disclose every shareholder, every financial backer, every business relationship. Executives underwent background investigations that examined decades of financial records, business partnerships, and personal associations. Even low-level employees, dealers, waitresses, security guards, had to submit to fingerprinting and criminal background checks. The mob would have to get past this wall to access Atlantic City's money. It wouldn't be easy. But organized crime had been infiltrating legitimate businesses for 70 years. They had methods. They had patience. They had millions of dollars to invest in the long game. And they had no intention of staying out. March 1978, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Angelo Bruno's home. Angelo Bruno sat in his living room and studied the opportunity. Resorts International was scheduled to open in May. The financial projections were staggering. Legal casinos generating millions in daily revenue. 1 building, 1 operation. More cash flowing through in a month than most traditional mob rackets generated in a year. And Atlantic City was 45 minutes from Philadelphia. Bruno was 70 years old. He'd controlled the Philadelphia mob since 1959, 19 years of steady, disciplined leadership. They called him the Gentle Don because he avoided unnecessary violence, preferred negotiation to bloodshed, ran his organization like a business rather than a street gang. Under his leadership, the Philadelphia family had maintained relatively peaceful relations with New York's 5 families and had avoided the internal bloodshed that plagued other organizations. His territory included South Jersey. That meant Atlantic City fell under his jurisdiction, at least in theory. But Bruno understood the new landscape. Legal gambling was different. You couldn't just muscle in. You couldn't threaten casino executives with violence and expect them to cooperate. Not when every executive needed a state license that could be revoked at the first hint of mob contact. The infiltration would need to be subtle, methodical, invisible. Bruno's strategy: control the labor. Casino operations required thousands of employees: dealers, waitresses, bartenders, cooks, housekeepers, security guards. All those jobs were union positions, and unions meant leverage. The key was Local 54 of the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Union. Local 54 represented hospitality workers throughout South Jersey. If you wanted to work in a casino, serving drinks, cleaning rooms, cooking meals, you needed to be in Local 54. And if elements within Local 54's leadership had connections to organized crime, those connections could potentially be exploited for influence. The Philadelphia organization had existing relationships with certain union officials. Not direct control, nothing that obvious, but relationships built over years of operating in overlapping territories. Favors owed, debts remembered. The kind of informal influence that didn't appear in organizational charts but could be leveraged when necessary. The strategy was elegant. The mob wouldn't own the casinos, wouldn't skim from the count rooms, wouldn't try to install frontmen as executives. They'd try to influence the people who made the casinos function. And if casino management ever refused to cooperate with mob-connected vendors or contractors, labor problems could theoretically materialize. A strike would cost a casino hundreds of thousands of dollars per day, maybe more. That potential leverage was valuable. But Philadelphia wasn't the only family circling Atlantic City. April 1978, New York City, a social club in Little Italy. Carlo Gambino was dead. Paul Castellano now controlled the Gambino family, the largest, wealthiest, most powerful crime organization in America. Castellano looked at Atlantic City and saw something Angelo Bruno apparently didn't: a cash operation too large for one family to control. Resorts International was just the beginning. The state had approved the framework for multiple casinos. Within years, additional casinos would open. Caesars Boardwalk Regency would open in June 1979. Bally's Park Place would follow in December 1979. Harrah's Marina would open in 1980. The Golden Nugget would open in 1980. Trump Plaza would eventually follow. Billions in revenue would flow through these properties. The New York families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, wanted their share. Castellano's approach was more aggressive than Bruno's. The Gambino family had decades of experience infiltrating New York's construction industry. They knew how to rig bids, inflate contracts, and extract profit from legitimate projects through control of construction unions, particularly the Laborers International Union and various Teamsters locals. The Genovese family took a similar approach. Vincent the Chin Gigante, operating through front boss Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, began identifying which construction companies were bidding on casino projects. The concrete industry in New York and New Jersey was heavily influenced by organized crime. The Concrete Club, a cartel of mob-connected concrete suppliers, controlled major construction projects throughout the region. The Lucchese family had established influence over waste disposal operations and certain service industries. Both sectors would be essential to casino operations. Garbage collection was a daily necessity, and service contracts represented steady revenue streams. The strategy was simple: become part of the infrastructure. Make the casinos dependent on mob-influenced services. Once the dependency was established, the prices could rise, the contracts could expand, the influence could deepen. But all of this required one critical step: getting past the Division of Gaming Enforcement. June 1978, Trenton, New Jersey. Division of Gaming Enforcement Headquarters. The DGE operated out of government offices in Trenton and Atlantic City, but its mandate was sweeping. Every casino license applicant, whether a corporation applying to operate a casino or an individual applying to deal cards, underwent investigation. The DGE examined financial records, criminal histories, business associations, family connections, even social relationships. The investigators were thorough. Former FBI agents, former prosecutors, accountants who specialized in tracing money through shell corporations. They weren't looking for proof of guilt. They were looking for unsuitability. If you'd been arrested, even without conviction, that raised questions. If you'd associated with known mobsters, even socially, that raised questions. If your business partners had mob ties, even distant ones, that raised questions. And if the DGE determined you were unsuitable, you lost your license, or never received one in the first place. The burden of proof was reversed. In criminal court, prosecutors had to prove guilt. In casino licensing, applicants had to prove suitability. The DGE's first major test came with Resorts International itself. The company had a complex corporate history. It had previously operated casinos in the Bahamas, including the Paradise Island Casino, which had attracted scrutiny over potential organized crime involvement. The DGE spent 18 months investigating Resorts International's ownership structure, financial backers, and management team before granting approval. The investigation examined whether organized crime figures had hidden ownership stakes, whether any executives had undisclosed relationships with mobsters, whether the company's Bahamas operations had involved money laundering or other illegal activities. The DGE found issues enough to raise concerns, but not enough to deny the license outright. Resorts International agreed to certain conditions and restrictions. The company restructured its management, severed certain business relationships, submitted to ongoing monitoring. The message was clear: even legitimate corporations would face intense scrutiny. The DGE's director understood exactly what his agency was fighting. He'd studied Las Vegas, knew how the mob had infiltrated casinos in the 1950s and 1960s, knew about the skim operations, millions of dollars removed from count rooms before official tallies, packed into suitcases, flown to Kansas City and Chicago. Knew about frontmen like Alan Glick, who ostensibly owned the Stardust and Fremont casinos but actually answered to mob bosses. The philosophy: assume everyone is potentially compromised until proven otherwise. Casino corporations applying for licenses faced months, sometimes years, of investigation. The DGE examined every executive, every board member, every major shareholder. If anyone in the corporate structure had mob connections, the license could be denied or granted with strict conditions requiring that individual's removal. But DGE officials knew the mob wouldn't try to own casinos directly. They'd infiltrate through the edges, through employees, through vendors, through unions, through construction contractors. The DGE's job was to block every access point. The exclusion list was the agency's most powerful weapon. Based on Nevada's Black Book, the list identified individuals barred from entering any Atlantic City casino. If you were on the list, Casino security had to escort you off the property immediately. If a casino allowed you to remain, even unknowingly, they risked losing their license. The list included obvious names: mob bosses, convicted racketeers, known enforcers, but it also included people with less formal ties: associates, relatives, business partners. Being excluded didn't require a criminal conviction. It required the DGE's determination that your presence posed a threat to casino integrity. The mob hated the exclusion list because once you were on it, you became radioactive. Casino executives couldn't meet with you, couldn't do business with you, couldn't be seen in your company without risking regulatory consequences. It was isolation by bureaucracy. July 1978, Atlantic City, Resorts International Casino. The casino floor was packed. Every table was full, every slot machine occupied. The sound was overwhelming: coins clattering, dealers calling bets, dice rattling across felt. Resorts International generated approximately $16 million in gross gaming revenue during its first month of operation. The figure exceeded state projections and demonstrated the enormous pent-up demand for legal gambling in the region. The crowds didn't stop coming. By the end of 1978, Resorts International had generated over $134 million in gaming revenue from a single property operating for less than 8 months. But the DGE was watching everything. Surveillance cameras covered every angle of the gaming floor, not just for cheating, for compliance. The DGE wanted to know who was gambling, who was loitering, who was meeting with casino employees. State regulators maintained a presence inside the casino. Observers who monitored operations, watched for irregularities, documented any suspicious behavior. Every dealer, every pit boss, every cocktail waitress had been licensed. Background checks completed. Financial records examined. If the DGE discovered someone had lied on their application, failed to disclose an arrest, concealed a relationship with a mobster, the license was revoked immediately. The system was designed to be unforgiving. Casino operators understood that their licenses were conditional. One serious violation, employing an unsuitable person, doing business with a mob-connected vendor, failing to report suspicious activity, could result in a license suspension or revocation. The financial stakes were astronomical. Losing a casino license meant losing hundreds of millions in investment. But the mob was patient. They knew they couldn't infiltrate the casinos directly, so they focused on the infrastructure around the casinos. August 1978, Atlantic City, Local 54 Union Hall. Local 54 was powerful because it controlled access to casino employment. The union represented thousands of hospitality workers, bartenders, waiters, housekeepers, cooks, bellhops. In a city where unemployment remained high despite the casino boom, union membership meant job security and decent wages. Union leadership determined hiring priorities, negotiated contracts with casino management, and could theoretically call strikes that would shut down casino operations. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, federal investigators began documenting connections between certain local 54 officials and Philadelphia organized crime figures. The relationships weren't always direct. No formal organizational chart linked mob bosses to union leadership, but surveillance, wiretaps, and informant testimony gradually revealed a pattern of influence. Some union officials socialized with known mob associates. Some accepted financial assistance from mob-connected individuals. Some made decisions that benefited mob interests, steering contracts to favored vendors, pressuring casino management to use specific suppliers. tolerating loan sharks operating near casino properties. The influence was real, but fragmentary. Not total control, nothing approaching the systematic domination organized crime had achieved over certain unions in New York and Chicago, but enough influence to matter. The subcontractor strategy worked like this. A casino needed services, linens for thousands of hotel rooms and restaurant tables, waste disposal for tons of daily garbage, vending machines for employee break rooms and public areas, food suppliers for multiple restaurants, construction contractors for ongoing renovations and expansions. Mob-connected companies would bid for these contracts. Their prices were often higher than competitors, but they had advantages, established relationships with union officials who could create labor problems if management chose different vendors, reputations for reliability, meaning they wouldn't suddenly strike or fail to deliver during critical periods. Implicit threats that choosing competitors might result in operational difficulties. Casino management faced a calculation. Paying somewhat inflated prices for essential services might be cheaper than dealing with labor disruptions, delivery problems, or other complications. This wasn't the massive skimming operation that had existed in Las Vegas. The DGE's oversight made large-scale cash theft nearly impossible. But smaller-scale profiteering, overcharging for legitimate services, extracting premium prices through implicit pressure, was harder to detect and prosecute. The mob didn't need to skim from the gaming floor. They were taxing the casino's operational expenses. September 1978, Atlantic City, construction site for Caesars Boardwalk Regency. Caesars was building what would become the second casino to open in Atlantic City. The construction required concrete, steel, electrical work, plumbing, carpentry, hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts. Organized crime families, particularly the Genovese family, had established influence over portions of the New York and New Jersey construction industry. Through relationships with labor unions, particularly the Laborers International Union and certain Teamsters locals, mob-connected figures could influence which companies received subcontracts. The concrete industry was especially compromised. The Concrete Club, later exposed in federal investigations, was a cartel that controlled concrete supply for major construction projects in New York and New Jersey. Mob-connected concrete suppliers could inflate prices, knowing that developers had limited alternatives. Casino developers needed to finish construction quickly. Every month of delay meant lost revenue. Millions of dollars in gaming income that couldn't be recovered. So when contractors warned that labor problems might slow projects, or when certain suppliers offered guaranteed delivery schedules, developers often paid premium prices to avoid delays. The DGE tried to block this infiltration. Every major contractor had to undergo background checks, but subcontractors were harder to investigate. Hundreds of companies bid on small parts of large projects. Electrical subcontractors, plumbing subcontractors, carpentry crews, equipment suppliers. The DGE couldn't investigate them all with the same intensity it applied to casino corporations. The mob exploited those gaps. But the DGE was learning. October 1978, Trenton, New Jersey, DGE headquarters. State investigators reviewed intelligence reports from the New Jersey State Police and FBI. Surveillance teams had documented meetings between known mob figures and certain union officials. Wiretaps had captured conversations, carefully worded, deliberately vague but suggestive, about casino contracts and labor relations. The evidence wasn't strong enough for criminal prosecution, but it was strong enough to trigger licensing consequences. The DGE issued guidance to all casino operators. Any executive who met with known mob associates, even socially, would face licensing review. Any vendor with documented ties to organized crime would be barred from casino property. Any employee found to have undisclosed relationships with mobsters would have their license revoked. The policy was aggressive, probably unprecedented in the gaming industry, and it worked, at least partially. Casino executives became extremely cautious about their associations. They stopped taking meetings with anyone who hadn't been vetted by their legal departments, stopped attending events where mob figures might be present. The risk of losing a casino license worth hundreds of millions of dollars far outweighed any benefit from cooperating with organized crime. The regulatory wall was holding, but the mob wasn't giving up. 1979, Atlantic City. Multiple casinos now operating. Caesars Boardwalk Regency opened in June 1979. Bally's Park Place opened in December 1979. Atlantic City was becoming a legitimate gambling destination. Revenue was climbing, employment was rising, the city's economy was finally recovering. Over 6,000 new jobs were created in the first year of casino operations. But beneath the surface, federal investigators were documenting organized crime's attempts to influence Local 54. The union's pension and welfare funds became a focus of investigation. Union pension funds held millions of dollars, money contributed by casino operators to provide retirement and health benefits for workers. Federal law required that these funds be managed solely in the interest of union members. But investigations revealed questionable management decisions. Some pension fund investments went to mob-connected businesses. Loans were made to companies with poor credit histories but connections to organized crime figures. The interest rates were sometimes below market value, effectively transferring union money to mob-affiliated enterprises. The FBI began investigating these transactions in the late 1970s, building cases that would eventually lead to RICO prosecutions. 1980, Philadelphia. The assassination that changed everything. March 21st, 1980, South Philadelphia. Angelo Bruno's car. Bruno sat in the passenger seat. His driver, John Stanfa, sat beside him. They'd just returned from dinner. Routine, uneventful. The shotgun blast came from behind, through the rear window. Struck Bruno in the back of the head. He died instantly. The murder wasn't about Atlantic City. It was internal mob politics. Bruno's refusal to authorize drug trafficking had created resentment among younger members who saw enormous profit potential in heroin and cocaine distribution. Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro of Philadelphia Capo orchestrated the hit without authorization from the Commission, the governing body of organized crime families. But the assassination had immediate consequences for Atlantic City. Bruno's death triggered a succession war. Multiple factions vied for control of the Philadelphia mob. The violence was spectacular and sustained. Between 1980 and 1986, approximately 40 mob-related murders occurred in Philadelphia and South Jersey. Bombings, shootings, bodies discovered in car trunks and vacant lots. The bloodshed was so intense it attracted national media attention. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo eventually emerged as the new boss. And Scarfo was everything Bruno wasn't. Scarfo was violent, paranoid, and reckless. He'd spent years in relative exile in Atlantic City during the 1970s, running a small bookmaking operation, while Bruno kept him at arm's length. Scarfo harbored resentment about his marginalization and had developed a reputation for extreme brutality. He'd been involved in multiple murders, including stabbing a longshoreman to death in 1963, a crime for which he served less than a year in prison due to a controversial plea deal. When Scarfo took control of the Philadelphia family in 1981, his approach to Atlantic City was crude and aggressive. He wanted immediate profit, wanted visible demonstrations of power, wanted to extract money quickly rather than build sustainable criminal enterprises. Scarfo began pushing for more aggressive extortion. He demanded that casino contractors pay street tax, protection money for the right to do business in Atlantic City. He authorized loan sharking operations targeting casino employees and gamblers. He pressured union officials to be more confrontational with casino management. This aggressive approach was exactly what federal investigators had been waiting for. 1981. Newark, New Jersey. FBI Field Office. The FBI had been investigating Atlantic City's unions and construction industry for 3 years. Surveillance wiretaps informants building cases under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO. RICO, enacted in 1970, was designed to prosecute entire criminal enterprises, not just individual crimes. If prosecutors could prove that an organization, like a union or construction company, was being used to commit a pattern of racketeering activity, they could dismantle the entire structure and impose severe penalties, including asset forfeiture. The key, proving that specific individuals were acting on behalf of organized crime. The FBI's Atlantic City investigation, codenamed Operation Johnson's, focused on union corruption and construction industry infiltration. Agents installed wiretaps on phones used by suspected mob associates, conducted physical surveillance of meetings between union officials and known organized crime figures, recruited informants who could provide inside information about extortion schemes and illegal payments. The FBI's wiretaps captured incriminating conversations. Union officials discussing pension fund loans to mob-connected businesses, loans that served organized crime interests rather than union members' retirement security. Discussions about which vendors should receive casino contracts, with decisions based on mob connections rather than competitive bidding. Conversations about street tax collections, extortion payments demanded from contractors working on casino projects. The evidence was accumulating, but prosecutors needed more. They needed cooperating witnesses who could testify about the organizational structure, who gave orders, who received profits, how the system actually functioned. 1982 to 1984. Philadelphia and Atlantic City. The Scarfo era was generating cooperating witnesses. Scarfo's paranoid leadership style and willingness to murder his own members created internal discontent. Several Philadelphia mob figures, facing murder charges or long prison sentences, decided to cooperate with federal investigators. These witnesses provided testimony about the mob's Atlantic City operations. They described how construction contracts were rigged, how union officials took direction from mob figures, how street tax was collected from casino contractors, how loan sharking operations functioned near casino properties. The testimony wasn't always about massive conspiracies or systematic control. Often, it revealed smaller-scale corruption. Individual mob associates pressuring specific contractors, isolated incidents of extortion, fragmented rather than comprehensive criminal operations. But the testimony was enough to build RICO cases. 1984 to 1985, Federal Courthouse, Newark, and Philadelphia. RICO prosecutions began targeting union corruption and construction industry infiltration. Federal prosecutors charged multiple union officials with racketeering, focusing on pension fund mismanagement and labor extortion. The cases alleged that union leadership had allowed organized crime figures to influence union decisions in exchange for personal benefits, cash payments, jobs for relatives, protection from internal union challenges. The trials revealed the mechanisms of corruption. Prosecutors presented wiretap recordings of incriminating conversations, financial records showing questionable pension fund investments, testimony from cooperating witnesses describing how mob figures exerted influence over union decisions. The convictions were significant, but not total. Some union officials were convicted and sentenced to federal prison. Others were acquitted. The verdicts demonstrated that while organized crime had achieved some influence over portions of Local 54 and other unions, the infiltration was not as systematic or comprehensive as it had been in other industries or in Las Vegas casinos. Nevertheless, the convictions had consequences. Courts imposed oversight on certain union operations. Federal monitors were appointed to supervise pension fund management and ensure compliance with labor laws. Background checks were implemented for union leadership positions. The mob's ability to use unions as primary infiltration tools was significantly diminished. But the damage extended beyond unions. 1984, Atlantic City, Harrah's Marina Hotel Casino. Kenneth Shapiro had connections to Philadelphia organized crime. He'd been involved in illegal gambling operations and had documented relationships with mob figures. He also worked as a labor consultant, ostensibly advising companies on union relations. Shapiro had business dealings with entities connected to Atlantic City casinos. Not direct employment by casino corporations, but relationships with contractors and suppliers doing business with casinos. The DGE discovered these connections during routine investigations of casino vendors. The agency issued directives. Any company doing business with Atlantic City casinos had to sever relationships with Shapiro, or risk losing the ability to work in the casino industry. Casino operators had to ensure that their contractors and suppliers weren't employing or partnering with mob-connected individuals. Companies complied immediately. The financial stakes were too high. Losing casino contracts meant losing millions in revenue. Shapiro was effectively isolated from the Atlantic City gambling industry without ever being criminally charged. The DGE's exclusion list expanded throughout the 1980s. Nicodemo Scarfo, excluded. His mere presence on casino property would trigger license violations for the casino operator. Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, excluded. Scarfo's nephew and underboss, known for extreme violence and multiple murder convictions. Multiple Philadelphia mob members and associates, excluded. Several New York mob figures with documented interest in Atlantic City operations, excluded. The list became a weapon. If you were on it, you couldn't enter any casino. Couldn't meet with casino executives, couldn't do business with casino vendors. You were isolated from the entire Atlantic City gambling industry. The mob had never faced this kind of systematic exclusion. In Las Vegas, excluded individuals could still exert influence through intermediaries. Trusted associates who weren't on the black book could conduct business on their behalf. But in Atlantic City, the DGE monitored those intermediaries too. Anyone who served as a bridge between organized crime and casino operations risked their own licensing consequences. Casino corporations, increasingly dominated by publicly traded companies with shareholders and regulatory obligations, had no incentive to tolerate even indirect mob influence. The regulatory penalties were too severe. Corporate executives faced personal liability if their companies were found to have mob connections. The regulatory wall wasn't just holding, it was becoming impenetrable. 1986 to 1987, Philadelphia. Nicodemo Scarfo was destroying his own organization. His reign was marked by paranoia and violence. He ordered murders over perceived disrespect. killed his own members over suspicions of disloyalty, often without evidence, turned the Philadelphia mob into a war zone. Between 1980 and 1986, approximately 40 mob-related murders occurred in Philadelphia and South Jersey during the Scarfo era. The bloodshed attracted massive federal attention. FBI surveillance intensified. Wiretaps multiplied. Informants emerged from within the organization, members who feared they'd be Scarfo's next victims. Scarfo's Atlantic City operations collapsed under the weight of law enforcement pressure and internal instability. The aggressive extortion tactics that Scarfo favored, demanding immediate cash payments from contractors, threatening violence against those who refused, generated complaints to law enforcement. Casino operators and contractors reported extortion attempts to the D, GE, and FBI. These reports triggered investigations that led to arrests. 1988, Federal Courthouse, Philadelphia. Scarfo went on trial. Racketeering, multiple murders, extortion, drug trafficking conspiracy. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Wiretaps recorded Scarfo ordering hits and discussing criminal operations. Witnesses, including several former mob members who decided to cooperate, testified about the organization's structure and criminal activities. Financial records showed illegal income from various rackets, including some Atlantic City operations. Scarfo was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to 55 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man approaching 60. His underboss, Philip Leonetti, eventually decided to cooperate with federal authorities. In 1989, Leonetti became a government witness, providing testimony that led to additional convictions of Philadelphia mob members and revealing details about the organization's Atlantic City operations. Leonetti's cooperation was devastating for what remained of the Philadelphia mob's Atlantic City interests. He described extortion schemes, identified mob-connected contractors and union officials, and provided prosecutors with insider knowledge that could be used in additional cases. The Philadelphia mob's Atlantic City operation was finished. By the late 1980s, the organization was in terminal decline. Leadership decimated by prosecutions and murders, membership depleted by defections and imprisonment. The disciplined criminal enterprise that Angelo Bruno had led was reduced to a collection of small-time operators running street-level rackets. 1988 to 1990, Atlantic City. By the late 1980s, organized crime's position in Atlantic City had become untenable. The financial calculation was simple. The risk far outweighed the reward. In Las Vegas during the 1960s and 1970s, the mob had skimmed millions directly from casino count rooms. That massive revenue stream had justified the risk of operating in a hostile environment. Federal investigations, occasional prosecutions, internal violence. In Atlantic City, the DGE's oversight made large-scale skimming impossible. Surveillance cameras monitored every transaction. State regulators audited financial records constantly. Casino count rooms operated under conditions that made systematic theft nearly impossible. The mob's revenue from Atlantic City came from smaller operations, inflated vendor contracts, loan sharking near casino properties, street tax collected from some contractors, occasional labor extortion. But those smaller operations attracted federal RICO prosecutions, which meant long prison sentences in federal facilities, no parole, no early release, which meant cooperating witnesses who testify to avoid those sentences, which meant more prosecutions, more convictions, more organizational damage. The mob was losing money, losing members, and gaining nothing of strategic value. The DGE continued its aggressive oversight throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Every casino transaction was monitored. Every employee was licensed. Every vendor was investigated. Any hint of mob influence triggered immediate action: license revocations, exclusions, referrals for criminal prosecution. Casino operators themselves had no incentive to cooperate with organized crime. The financial penalties were too severe. Casino corporations were increasingly publicly traded companies with shareholders, board members, and legal departments. They couldn't risk regulatory sanctions by tolerating mob infiltration. Corporate executives faced personal liability, loss of their own gaming licenses, damage to professional reputations, potential criminal charges for knowingly doing business with organized crime figures. The casino industry had transformed. The early operations like Resorts International and Caesars were joined by major corporate players. Harrah's Entertainment, a publicly traded corporation. Trump Entertainment, despite its founder's controversial business practices, operated under strict regulatory oversight. These companies had compliance departments, internal audit systems, and legal teams dedicated to avoiding any appearance of mob influence. Atlantic City had become the worst possible environment for organized crime. High surveillance, aggressive prosecution, zero tolerance for corruption, and most critically, no significant financial reward that justified the enormous risks. The mob quietly withdrew from systematic attempts at infiltration. Individual mob associates continued operating in Atlantic City through the 1990s. Loan sharking targeting problem gamblers, street-level drug dealing, occasional low-level extortion. But the institutional infiltration had failed. The mob didn't control unions in any meaningful way, didn't control vendor relationships, didn't influence casino management, didn't extract systematic profit from the gambling industry. The dream of an East Coast Vegas, a territory where organized crime could generate millions through infiltration of legal gambling, was dead. 1995, Atlantic City, boardwalk at night. The city had changed. 12 casinos now operated along the boardwalk and Marina District. Atlantic City generated over $3.9 billion in annual gaming revenue by the mid-1990s, making it the second largest gambling market in America after Las Vegas. Millions of tourists visited annually. Employment had recovered significantly, though not to the levels initially projected. The boardwalk had been renovated. Major hotel brands operated properties. Atlantic City wasn't the decaying resort of the 1970s, and organized crime had no systematic control over the casino industry. The contrast with Las Vegas was striking and instructive. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931 and spent the next 50 years struggling to purge mob influence from its casinos. The struggle required multiple approaches: aggressive FBI investigations beginning in the 1960s, the federal government's use of RICO prosecutions in the 1970s and 1980s, internal mob figures turning informant, like Frank Collada's 1982 testimony against Tony Spilotro, and fundamental changes in casino ownership structures. But even after those changes, Nevada's regulatory system remained somewhat reactive. The Nevada Gaming Control Board and Gaming Commission responded to mob infiltration after it occurred. They'd revoke licenses, ban individuals, impose sanctions, but often only after organized crime had already established positions within casinos. New Jersey's system was proactive. The DGE assumed infiltration would be attempted and built regulatory walls before the mob could breach them. The philosophical difference was fundamental. Nevada regulated gambling as an industry that needed oversight to prevent abuse. New Jersey regulated gambling as a potential target that required active defense against criminal infiltration. The licensing requirements were more stringent. The background investigations were more thorough. The exclusion process was more aggressive. The penalties for violations were more severe. Casino operators understood from day one that any mob connection, no matter how distant or indirect, could result in license revocation. That understanding shaped behavior. Casino corporations invested heavily in compliance. They conducted their own background checks on employees and vendors. They reported suspicious activity to regulators proactively rather than waiting to be investigated. They understood that cooperation with the DGE was essential to maintaining their licenses. The system worked because the incentives aligned. Casino operators had billions of dollars at stake. The DGE had enforcement power backed by state law. Organized crime had infiltration methods that had worked in other contexts, but those methods couldn't overcome determined, well-resourced regulatory opposition. The Atlantic City model became the template for legal gambling regulation across the United States. When Pennsylvania legalized casino gambling in 2004, the state legislature studied New Jersey's Casino Control Act extensively. Pennsylvania created the Gaming Control Board with similar investigative powers, similar licensing requirements, similar exclusion procedures. When Maryland legalized casinos in 2008, state officials visited Atlantic City to study the DGE's operations. Maryland implemented comparable background check systems and suitability standards. When Massachusetts legalized casino gambling in 2011, the legislation explicitly referenced New Jersey's regulatory framework as a model. The Massachusetts Gaming Commission adopted similar procedures for investigating casino license applicants and monitoring operations. New York, Ohio, Michigan. State after state, as legal gambling expanded across America, legislators studied what had worked in Atlantic City. They saw a regulatory system that had successfully prevented systematic mob infiltration. Not perfectly, not without ongoing vigilance, but far more effectively than Nevada's approach had achieved during its first decades. The regulatory fortress that kept organized crime from controlling Atlantic City's casinos became the national standard. The irony was profound. Organized crime had spent decades operating illegal gambling, bookmaking, numbers rackets, underground casinos. They were the experts in gambling operations. When states began legalizing casinos, the mob should have had competitive advantages. Expertise in gaming operations, existing capital to invest, experience managing cash-intensive businesses. But legalization changed the equation. Legal casinos operated in public view, under regulatory oversight, with transparent ownership structures. The very things that made organized crime effective in illegal gambling, secrecy, intimidation, willingness to use violence, became liabilities in the legal environment. The DGE's success in Atlantic City proved that organized crime could be kept out of legal gambling if regulators had sufficient resources, clear legal authority, and unwavering political support. New Jersey provided all three. The Casino Control Act gave the DGE sweeping investigative powers. The state legislature funded the agency adequately, understanding that effective regulation required staff, technology, and ongoing operations. Governors from both parties supported the DGE's aggressive approach, recognizing that mob infiltration would destroy Atlantic City's gambling industry and the tax revenue it generated. That combination, legal authority, adequate resources, political support, made the difference. 2006, Atlantic City, the casino industry at its peak. Atlantic City's gaming revenue reached $5.2 billion in 2006. 11 casinos operated at or near capacity. The city employed approximately 45,000 casino workers. The New Jersey state government collected over $400 million in casino taxes that year, money that funded programs for seniors, disabled residents, and urban redevelopment projects statewide. But the peak was also the beginning of decline. Pennsylvania legalized slot machines at racetracks in 2004 and full casino gambling in 2006. The new Pennsylvania casinos were closer to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Atlantic City's traditional customer base. Maryland would legalize casinos in 2008. Delaware expanded gambling at racetracks. New York would eventually authorize casinos upstate and in the New York City area. Regional competition eroded Atlantic City's monopoly on East Coast gambling. Revenue began declining in 2007. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated the decline. Several casinos closed. Employment dropped. By 2014, only 8 casinos remained operating. But through all of this economic turbulence, one thing remained constant. Organized crime never regained a foothold. The DGE continued its oversight. Background checks remained thorough. The exclusion list remained enforced. When new casino operators purchased struggling properties, they underwent the same intensive licensing investigations that Resorts International had faced in 1977. The mob's organizational capacity had also declined. By the 2000s, the Philadelphia mob was a shadow organization, perhaps 24 active members, conducting small-scale illegal gambling and loan sharking, lacking the resources or coordination to attempt casino infiltration. The New York families were similarly weakened. Decades of RICO prosecutions had decimated their leadership, destroyed their organizational discipline, and eliminated their ability to conduct complex criminal enterprises. Organized crime no longer posed a credible threat to Atlantic City's casinos. Not because the mob had given up, because they'd been systematically defeated. 2020, Atlantic City, 9 casinos operating. The Mob Museum doesn't exist here. This isn't Vegas, because Atlantic City never romanticized its mob history, never turned organized crime into tourist attractions, never celebrated the era when crime families tried to infiltrate the casinos. The city's relationship with its mob history was fundamentally different from Las Vegas. Vegas eventually embraced its criminal past, opened museums, offered mob tours, marketed the mystique of wise guys and casino skimming. That romanticization was possible because Vegas had moved past its mob era. The criminals were dead or imprisoned. The modern casino industry was corporate, legitimate, respectable. Atlantic City never had a mob era to romanticize. The infiltration had been prevented before it could establish itself. There were no legendary mob bosses who'd controlled Atlantic City casinos, no dramatic skimming operations, no charismatic criminals who became folklore, just bureaucrats who said no, over and over, to every license application that raised red flags, to every vendor with mob connections, to every attempt at influence. And that persistent, unglamorous refusal had saved Atlantic City's gambling industry from the fate that befell Las Vegas. The DGE remained vigilant through 2020 and beyond. Background checks remained thorough. The exclusion list, now called the exclusion list, rather than the Black Book, continued to bar unsuitable individuals from casino properties. When new forms of gambling emerged, online gambling, sports betting, New Jersey applied the same rigorous regulatory framework. The Division of Gaming Enforcement had grown from its 1977 origins into a sophisticated regulatory agency with hundreds of employees, advanced technology for monitoring casino operations, and decades of institutional knowledge about how organized crime attempts to infiltrate legitimate businesses. But by 2020, the threat landscape had changed. The traditional organized crime families that had threatened Atlantic City in the 1970s and 1980s were largely defunct. The Philadelphia mob had perhaps a dozen active members. The New York families were decimated. The organizational structures that had made systematic infiltration possible no longer existed. New threats emerged: sophisticated money laundering schemes using casino transactions, international criminal organizations, cybercrime affecting online gambling platforms. The DGE adapted, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged: thorough investigation, aggressive enforcement, zero tolerance for criminal infiltration. The story of Atlantic City is the story of regulation defeating organized crime. Not through dramatic confrontations, not through informant testimony that brought down mob empires, not through violence or spectacular raids, through paperwork, background checks that took months to complete, licensing requirements that demanded complete financial disclosure, exclusion lists that barred unsuitable individuals from casino properties, financial audits that tracked every dollar, surveillance systems that monitored every transaction. The Division of Gaming Enforcement never fired shots in dramatic raids, never needed headline-grabbing arrests of major mob bosses. The victory was quieter than that. They just enforced the rules, consistently, relentlessly, without compromise. Casino corporations learned that mob connections meant automatic license denial. Vendors learned that organized crime relationships meant exclusion from the industry. Union officials learned that corruption meant federal prosecution. Casino employees learned that undisclosed mob associations meant immediate termination. The system worked because it was comprehensive, because it was consistent, because the state of New Jersey provided the resources and political support necessary to maintain it. And eventually, organized crime realized the truth. Atlantic City was a fortress they couldn't breach. The mob moved on, found easier targets, focused on traditional rackets in cities where regulation was weaker and law enforcement less coordinated. But they never forgot Atlantic City. The city represented their greatest strategic failure. Not a defeat in battle, they were never allowed on the battlefield. An exclusion, a rejection, a systematic demonstration that organized crime could be kept out of a legal, cash-intensive industry if regulators were determined enough. Las Vegas generated decades of mob profits before being cleaned up. Atlantic City never generated those profits because the cleanup happened before the infiltration could succeed. That difference, proactive defense versus reactive cleanup, changed the trajectory of legal gambling in America. November 2nd, 1976, New Jersey voters approved casino gambling. They were promised economic revitalization, job creation, tax revenue for social programs, a rebirth of Atlantic City's tourism industry. But the most important promise, the one that made all the others possible, was the promise to keep organized crime out. That promise was kept. Not perfectly. Individual mob associates operated in Atlantic City throughout the casino era. Some union corruption occurred. Some vendors had organized crime connections. Some contractors paid street tax to avoid problems. But systematic control, the kind of institutional infiltration that had characterized mob operations in Las Vegas, never materialized. The Philadelphia mob never controlled Atlantic City's casinos. The New York families never extracted significant profits from the gambling industry. The skim operations that had generated hundreds of millions in Vegas never took root in Atlantic City. The Casino Control Act worked. The Division of Gaming Enforcement worked. The exclusion list worked. The background checks worked. The licensing requirements worked. The regulatory fortress held. And that success had consequences beyond Atlantic City. It demonstrated that organized crime could be prevented from infiltrating legal industries if government applied sufficient resources and maintained consistent enforcement. It showed that legalization didn't have to mean mob control, that casinos could operate without systematic criminal infiltration, that regulation could be more powerful than intimidation. Atlantic City didn't defeat the mob with guns or informants. It defeated them with background checks and license applications and regulatory oversight. The mob tried to take Atlantic City. They failed. Not in a shootout, not in a trial, not in a moment of dramatic confrontation. They failed in the offices of the Division of Gaming Enforcement, failed in licensing hearings, failed when their applications were denied and their associates were excluded and their vendors were barred from casino properties. They lost to bureaucracy, to forms and regulations and career government employees who couldn't be bribed or threatened. And that loss changed the history of organized crime in America. Because after Atlantic City, the mob knew. Legal gambling was no longer their territory. The states had learned how to keep them out. The golden age of mob-controlled casinos died in Nevada, but it was buried in New Jersey, in a file cabinet, stamped application denied.